All right, good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us this morning. Welcome to this new webinar in the series on social and environmental and governance due diligence. This is the last webinar before the summer holidays, and today we'll focus on how to remotely identify ESG risks. This webinar is organized as part of the Belgian SDG Charter for International Development, and with the support from the Belgian Development Corporation. So if your organization hasn't signed the charter yet, is interested to sign it and join the 130 plus signatories, let me know. So let me remind you a few rules today, as always, and you've probably become experts in webinars now, so I'll go quick. All participants are muted, but feel free to participate via the chat if you want to interact with others. If you have questions, you address them in the Q&A module at the end, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. But you can, of course, write them down through the presentation. Please specify your name and organization when you ask a question, and specify whom the question is addressed to. This session is being recorded, so watch out for what you say. If you're facing technical issues, please contact Hive at the shift or ask directly in the chat, and we'll try to sort it out. So previous webinars, as you may have followed them, we focused on different aspects of the due diligence, and we tried to create a series. And first, we have explored the overall frameworks around due diligence and the OECD frameworks, etc. Then we went a bit more into details, starting with how to map the supply chain and how to identify your suppliers and the suppliers of your suppliers, etc., and go beyond tier 1 and tier 2. Then we try to understand what are the best practices to engage with your suppliers about sustainability, how to create a relationship with them, how to create trust with your suppliers, to discuss about those sometimes sensitive topics. And then today we want to explore how to identify and assess the environmental, social, and governance risk. And we often forget about the governance, but it's also important. So those risks faced by remote partners, clients, suppliers. Remote because often those risks are faced like in other countries abroad, and often in southern countries in Africa, Asia, or elsewhere. And so we have to do it remotely with the tools and the means that we have with our computer. But sometimes it's also needed to go on site. Due diligence it's not new. It's been done in the financial transactions for a while, and it's been done for environmental and social due diligence in different. The environmental and social due diligence has been done also for a while, but it's a bit more recent probably, and it's been applied in different contexts. For instance, sorry, I'm losing my slide here. For instance, it's been done in impact investment, well, in investment in general, but more specifically in impact investment when we want to focus on having a positive environmental and social impact. But overall, and I know you're many representatives of banks here today, if you want to invest in a project, you want to make sure that you don't invest in war-related project, a weapon, or something that a project that could be harmful to the environment. Due diligence, ESG due diligence has been done when you want to build an asset somewhere. It can be a road, it can be an electrical line somewhere in Africa, it can be a mining site, it can be either public, private projects. And first you have to assess potential environmental and social impact. It's been done when you acquire another company. You want to make sure that you don't invest in a company that is related to bad practice in terms of environmental and human rights abuse. It's been done also in the insurance sector and the export credits, as we will see today. And last but not least, and probably the most recent one, and the one that we're exploring the most, is the due diligence, ESG due diligence in supply chain, and it's also quite complex because there are multiple intermediaries. So we therefore thought that it would be interesting to create links between those different sectors and share expertise, practice, and tools between the different actors. So that's why we invited those today. And guess what? The audience today is also quite diversified and represents those different sectors. So don't hesitate to interact in the chat and leave your impression. So today with us, we have first Charlotte Verbeek. She's compliance and environmental and social analyst at Credendo, the official Belgian export credit agency. She will tell us about the ESG risk assessment in the international insurance and export credits sector. Then we have Edouard Crespin, who's a senior environmental and social officer at BioInvest, the Belgian investment company for developing countries. And he will tell us more about their practice and risk mapping and mitigation in the investment and development sector. Then we have Famke Schaap and Matthew Wojcik, expert consultant at Hive, a non-profit organization specialized in responsible sourcing and trade across global supply chain. They connect upstream and downstream stakeholders, and they will share practical cases from their projects with corporate clients and development partners. And then we have Hub House, who's PhD specialized in human rights due diligence and others from the Research Institute for Work and Society from the KU11. So HIVA, not to confuse with Hive. And Hive will help us find a way in those different approaches and tools, as there's no one fit for all solution. So he will give a short feedback and constructive feedback on each presentation and approach that is presented, to help us understand where and when the approach or the tool is or is not indicated and what could be the limitation. So now I'll leave the floor to Charlotte. Charlotte, if you can start sharing your screen and your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Yes. Alors. Can you see my screen? Perfect.
Yes, perfect.
Voila. Hello, everyone. So I'm Charlotte Verbeek. I am the environmental and social analyst at Credendo. And I will try to present you the how to identify the environmental, social, and governance risk in 15 minutes, which I hope I will do it, and which is quite a challenge. And I will first of all present a brief context of who we are, because not everyone knows who is Credendo. On the second part, I will present the main steps of the environmental and social analysis procedures that we are assuring. And on the third part, I will present in a more practical way, how do we do to evaluate the environmental, social, and governance risk. First of all, Credendo is the official Belgian export credit agency. We are an organization who has been created by the state, and the main objective of the organization is to promote exportation. Basically, we will give some insurance cover for Belgian companies who will export some equipment, goods, or who will export some services, or will execute some works in foreign countries. And generally, it's some foreign countries that are non-OECD countries, where the risks are the highest. And what type of risk? It's political risk, economical risk, and we will try to cover, we will cover the exporter against non-payment, political crisis that could cause some delay, etc. We are regulated by the OECD, and regarding the environmental and social aspects, the OECD produced one document, a recommendation of what are the procedures that all OECD members should apply as an export credit agency. This document is aiming the transaction that have a credit of 2 years or more, which means that if a transaction doesn't imply a credit of 2 years or more, it is not in the OECD scope, so we do not have to communicate this ENS due diligence information to the OECD. But what I would like to specify is that Credendo has corporate social responsibility engagement, apply the same ENS due diligence procedures for all of its export credit agency transactions. So even the cash transaction, the investment, we will apply these procedures. The main steps of this environmental and social analysis: first, we will do a screening. So we will, at first stage, screen all the basic information we have. What is the transaction, the budget, is it under the OECD scope, what is the sector, the country where the project will occur. Then on the second phase, we will do a more in details assessment of the environmental and social aspects. And what is important to underline is that we will not just assess the exporter works, which is sometimes a small part of a biggest project. All of the transactions are in a lot of cases related to a biggest project that will be developed in foreign countries, and our exporter will maybe just export equipment or do a small part of works in the whole project that will be developed in the foreign countries. And this will need a lot of information exchange with the exporter, but maybe also with the debtor. So the debtor, the company who did the contract with our exporter. Then, based on this ENS analysis, we will classify the transaction. A, B, C is the OECD classification. A is really high ENS risk, B moderate, and C is no impact or minimal impact, and N is not applicable. It's when it's not related to a geographical localization, not related to a project, bon, voilà, not applicable. Then a decision from the direction will occur, because it's important to know that the decision will be based first on the financial analysis, but also on the environmental and social analysis. And basically, it's the go or no go for cover. After this, I will not go in details, but we have some communication obligation, because as a public entity, we have to communicate some information according to the OECD regulation. And then there are some steps of monitoring after the police for cover has been emitted. We will assure also some post-monitoring process for some projects who have high ENS risk, but it's another subject. I will not go too much in details in here. What kind of information is important to assess the environmental and social risk and issues when you are far away, because we cannot go on every project site. So we are basically behind our computer. We will have to evaluate the legal framework. From one country to another, the legal requirements are really different regarding the environmental and social aspects. We will do a benchmark with international standards. There are some such as the EFC performance standards. Basically, it's some international standards that are recognized in order to develop in a compliant way, according to these standards, the ENS due diligence, to assure the ENS due diligence of the project. We will evaluate how the positive and the negative impacts have been took into consideration for the different projects. Are there some gaps with this? And not only the negative impact, but also the positive impact as well. We will evaluate the environmental and social impact assessment. So this is the document that evaluates all the impact, and that will evaluate the mitigation measures in order to minimize the impact. And this is one of the most important documents. And as an example, I was talking about legal framework. There are some countries where it's an obligation to realize an environmental impact assessment. And in another country, it's not an obligation. So it really depends from one project or another. It is possible that you may not obtain this document. See how the transparency of the project is in place. Are there some public consultation? And also an important part I will check is the role of responsibilities, because it's important to see, in case of ENS issues, who will be responsible of this. Even in developed countries, I have seen in my life several cases of pollution case, pollution incident, and there were no responsibility to anyone. And the conclusion of that was that the country where the project was developing had to pay for the mitigation measures. And how do we get all of these informations, which is the biggest challenge, because the data, the information is the main, well, the most important part of this work to do it when you are behind your computer. And we have an application form, which is basically a document that asks some questions, but it's a general document. And if we evaluate that there are potential risks, we have developed also some specific questionnaire. And I will not present in detail this questionnaire, but the questionnaire is related to a sector, and it's some specific questions that will aim to obtain this information needed. And one tool that looks simple, but actually for me, it's such a source of information when you are far away, is the desk research, because you can find a lot of information in the local press, from the citizen, if there are some issues, from journalists, from NGO that are in place and that do a work of explaining the potential issue related to a project. But there are some limits, because there are some countries where, of course, there are limitations in the freedom of press. But it's a really good tool. And even if you go check on the website of the different stakeholders that are involved, it's possible to see if the stakeholders have a sustainability program, that they are transparent, that they share a lot the information. These will be the kind of information that I will look during my research. But it's a case-by-case information exchange, and it will go much further in detail depending on the ENS risk. Just for information, for a really big project and high ENS risk, it's possible that we will also hire an external consultant to support us in our ENS due diligence. I will go now a bit more in details how to evaluate the whole supply chain. As I said, it's not only the exporter, and this is quite a challenge, because in most of the situation, the Belgian exporters are under the European regulation. So you can have a transaction where the equipment is, well, it will improve even so the environmental and social efficiency of the company. So it will be beneficial, but actually the equipment can go within a project that has some ENS issues. So it's really important to evaluate the whole supply chain, not only the exporter, but also the debtor. What are the reputation of them? What are the ENS due diligence that they are assuring? Have there some certifications that, that imply some ENS management of their operations? What are their level of transparency? The localization is quite an important point as well. As I said, depending on the country, the legal frameworks that are in place, what are the human rights impacts? I will analyze this depending on the country, the situation regarding the human rights, physical geographic context. You can have a localization that is sensitive to erosion, for example, that I know that there will be some environmental risk. And if it's an infrastructure project, then I will have to give further attention. Are there some sensitive area, etc. And finally, also, of course, the project, how it has been managed. What is the scope of works of the whole project? What are the different process? The level of transparency? Is there an ECA, an environmental impact assessment that is publicly available, etc. And finally, I will just talk briefly of two tools that are really useful, because when you cannot go on site, it exists some practical tools that are really useful. To name one, RepRisk is a tool that will basically give information on the risk exposure of companies, projects, but also sectors related to the country. And it will give you a RepRisk rating. The greener it is, the company, the lower will be the ESG risk of the company, and the redder, the higher the risk will be. And what is interesting is that it depends on the issues related to the company or to the project or to the sector, but also it will integrate the issues related to the company, but also the level of risk of the country sectors. So it's a model that is really, it's useful and easy to use, important to say, because easy to access. You just have access to the web page. And Ebat is another tool that we will affiliate this year. It's new. And this is database regarding biodiversity. It will give you the general information on the level of biodiversity, potential species that are risk sensitive area. And these tools, you have to pay to obtain it, but it's important to know that when you have a commercial purpose in your operations, generally there are a lot of data that are freely available but cannot be used for commercial purpose. And voila, this is my last slide. I will just conclude with the idea that the evaluation of the ENS risk is something that needs to be improved every day. Mainly my work, once you have the procedures, it's not the end of the story. It's important to be aware of all the different tools that are new, to adapt your procedures of the actual situation, and to adapt and improve as much as possible from one day to another. And I think I could talk more, but I think I will stop here because it's
perfect timing. Thank you very much, Charlotte. That was super clear and comprehensive. And indeed, it's important to highlight that there's always way to improve. I'll leave the word directly to her for a quick feedback.
Yes, thank you very much, Brieux, and also Charlotte for sort of delving into this complex story in a very short period of time. Let me start with some sort of broad remarks that do not apply necessarily specifically to Credendo, but let's say more in general terms. And I have to start by saying that my comments are not based on, in this case, on an in-depth assessment of, the work that Credendo does in this area, and neither for Bio. It is based on earlier research insights we have from similar assignments or related assignments and so on. But then again, we need to recognize, I think, start by recognizing the complexity of performing good ESG due diligence, and especially when there is no on-site presence, which complicates issues, of course. So already reference was made to some tools in the case of Credendo and sources of information and procedures. If we take one step back and we look at the overall picture of how institutes like Credendo and other actors have worked on this topic, I think we need to recognize that in the past there tended to be a bias towards environmental topics, rather than social due diligence. So often policies would be referring to both, but if you would look at the institutional capacity, the tools and the actions taken, often the social part was sort of a small, only a small box in the bigger picture. And I think what you will notice is that many agencies are now sort of strengthening their work in terms of social due diligence, but still a lot of things need to be done. And I think two specific challenges is, first of all, to make it an inclusive process. And then we always talk about the rights holders and their representatives, so trade unions and community groups and so on. So to invest in those tools that engage structurally with these kind of stakeholders is really key. A second challenge is like, how deep can you go into the value chain and supply chain? Quite some of the instruments that are being used go into tier one, sort of first, or check the direct client, the investee. but don't really manage to go much deeper, while we know from research that actually a lot of the violations or the problems with adverse human rights impacts actually happen in subcontracting arrangements with suppliers, migrant workers, and these kind of things. The second area or second issue that I think always needs to be considered as well is like on the data that is being consulted and developed, and then it is about issues of coverage, like what does the data allows us to say. For example, a tool like RepRisk that was looked at, which is really one of the comprehensive databases that are being used for these kind of exercises. Of course, at the end of the day, and I think that was already flagged as well, they use secondary material, information developed by NGOs, journalists, academic research, or other sources, but it doesn't really, of course, replace the sort of first-hand kind of due diligence activity. So we always need to complement these tools with additional screening. A second area around the data is transparency, and I think that is also still a challenge. I think for Credendo and other actors, it's like, okay, we are trying to strengthen our approach, but to what extent do we manage to align ourselves fully with sort of expectations raised in the UNGPs, the United Nations Guiding Principles, and sort of also reporting about those efforts, doing public reporting, sharing learning points, showing progress of how we are engaging with this topic. I think this is an area that generally can still be strengthened. And then a final point, I think, is on and that's maybe the most difficult one to resolve, is on the regulation of all the bodies and actors that do the assessment of ESG issues, or that certify ESG due diligence processes, because at the end of the day, these are often private actors. It's a largely self-regulated system, and this has some challenges, of course, because there's often no public oversight. There's no liability frames of reference. Professional codes are only internal, so it's one of the challenges, and we could delve into that later on. But for a lot of these systems to be fully privatized. So what to round off, what I see is systems being strengthened, which is very positive. But I guess also in the case of Credendo, the internal capacity to really go deeper might still need some further development. And I think that's probably one of the areas that I expect also to see more activity happening. So that's the first round of reactions.
Thanks a lot, Hive, for this very comprehensive feedback, and again, positive. Let's try to keep improving, and it's good to see that the systems are strengthening. Now leave the floor to Edouard from Bio. And start sharing the screen, and Charlotte, stop.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Brio. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So I'm a senior environmental and social officer at Bio. I'm part of a team of 3 persons. So we are 3 Guinness officers each of us focusing mainly on one type of investments. Still, we do share the work, depending on pipeline and so forth. So I work for Bio Investment for Bio, which is the Belgium investment company for developing countries. In short, it's the Belgium Development Bank. So we are owned 100% by the state. And yeah, and our board is composed of people from our governments and different political parties. I will present how at Bio we apply early environmental and social risk identification. Let me go to the next slide, which doesn't seem to be working. Okay, fine. So Bio was incorporated in 2001, so it's a rather recent company. We are now at a portfolio of close to 900 million euro invested. So we invest through loans or equity, but mainly loans in developing regions like mainly Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, but as well Latin America and Asia. This slide, okay, works progressively. So we invest in small and medium enterprises and into infrastructure projects. So this is what we call direct investments, where our investment through loans mainly goes to a company who has a mission to expand itself or build a greenfield renewable energy power plant, for example. But we as well do what we call indirect investments, which is we make loans or equity investment to financial institutions and private equity funds, whom themselves then invest this money locally in SMEs and other companies. So Bio is also part of the European Development Finance Institution Association. So basically, most of European countries have their own development banks. And as an association, we work together and apply the same standards, including our environment social approach. To make it very short, we mainly apply the IFC performance standards together with the ILO conventions and of course, the local law. But so when we look at projects, we of course look at the capacity of the project or the company to manage its own environmental and social risks, at labor conditions and health and safety at work. We also look at resource efficiency and pollution prevention, basically air emissions, treatment of wastewater and so forth. We look as well to community safety and security. So how can the project locally affect the safety and security of local communities? Then, depending on the type of projects, for example, greenfield projects could as well trigger what we call IFCPS 5 to 8, which is related to land acquisition, which could have as a consequence physical or economic displacement. And thereby, we need to make sure the projects, compensate the people and ensure the restoration of their livelihoods. We also look, of course, at biodiversity and whether there is any natural or critical habitat, that there is a compensation framework in place, and as well if there are indigenous people, to make sure that there is a broad consultation and free prior informed consent, and as well cultural heritage, which is tangible cultural heritage like archaeological sites or cemetery, but as well intangible, like in Africa you could have in some communities place of worship, genius sites, etc. So intangible cultural heritage, we also need to identify, our clients need to identify them and make sure that they are taken into account in the project development. So how do we apply ENS into our investment cycle? So at screening stage, we look at the projects from far away or on a desktop basis. This is what we will mainly cover today. So how do we assess the risk around the project and the risk of the project itself, and then take our decision to invest or not, and also take our decision on how to perform a more in-depth due diligence. And then we have the due diligence in itself, which is going on site, for example, reviewing documentation in more details. And based on our findings, we will make recommendations, which we will include in an environmental and social action plan, which is entirely part of our investment contract. And we will make sure that actions are conditioned to our investment. So we may have, if we have red flag issues, we may make them conditioned subsequent to signing. So when we tell the client, we will not sign until you have done this. And then as well, CPs for disbursement. So where the client implementation of our recommendations, only once this is done, then we will disburse the loan in several tranches. And then we have the monitoring phase, of course. In terms of early risk assessments, we perform what we call a contextual risk analysis. So what is it? We look at the country context, the sector context, and the project context, and any ENS risk related to that, and how the context can interfere with the project ability to achieve its ENS compliance or performance. So we would think, for example, like the country rule of law or level of corruptions, which will affect the capacity of the environmental authorities or labor authorities, for example, to make sure that the laws are indeed followed. We will look at any land disputes or conflict areas. So anything that could affect the project capacity to fulfill its environmental and social obligations. So I'm going to quickly present the tool. So we have 3 different tabs. Let me know if you see my screen, because I'm not sure if my screen...
Not yet, no. It's still focused on your presentation.
Because I'm not sure if I had shared my screen or my presentation. So that's...
Apparently you shared the presentation.
Okay, let me go back then to the Zoom, which doesn't seem to work too much neither.
I think you have to stop the sharing of the screen and then do it again, and to open the window that you need to. I think it's the only way.
Okay, that's coming. I'm sorry for this technological hiccup. Here we are. Okay. Brio, is that working now?
Yep, it's working.
Okay, excellent. So we have 3 tabs: the country level tab, the sector level tab, and the project level tab. At the country level, we will look at these indexes, which are publicly available online and free to use. And we will look at what are the country reliability risks, so the fragile state index and governance quality indexes. And according to the performance of the country, we would be able to score the region or the country as high, medium, or low risk. So we will look at government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruptions. This will tell us to what extent there is a good level of quality, environmental and social regulation, and to what extent it is likely to be applied. If none, then we know we likely have to make more work on our side as well in terms of verification and monitoring. We look as well at social and community risk. For example, at land tenure security. So are people feeling safe in terms of owning or using their land? To the Human Development Index, which is very known, but the more poverty or low human development you will have locally, the more you're likely to face vulnerable people around your project. And we also look at the presence of indigenous people, because if there are indigenous people, then we will need to trigger IFCPS 7 and make sure that the project, is consulting with communities and assessing its impact in what we call a culturally appropriate way, which means using indigenous people language, making sure that they are fully informed of the project, that they provide their full consent for it, and so on. We will look as well at human rights risk. So is there a risk of attacks against human rights defenders? Is there sufficiently space for civic expression? And as the country ratified the basic human rights treaties. We will also look at workers' rights risk. So there is the I2 Global Rights Index, which provides a ranking of whether you are in a country with no guarantee of workers' rights at all or systemic violations and so forth. We look as well at the ratification of the ILO core labor standards, and then we will look as well at the minimum. Is there a minimum wage at the country level? To what level is it compared to the World Bank, poverty threshold, and to the poverty threshold of the country, if there is one, and to the living wage, if one was assessed. And then we'll also look at environmental risk like biodiversity, the key biodiversity area. KBA, it's a website who provides coverage of all the key areas of biodiversity around the globe. If you are in one of them, doesn't mean you are in a natural habitat or there is an impact on biodiversity, but it means you need to look at this at least. We look at deforestation rates, at water stress risk and physical climate risk. And then all these risks, you will have them from low to high. You can have a high risk, for example, biodiversity, but then you have to make your own assessment. Does it apply to the project? If your project doesn't have any green field or likely impact on biodiversity, then you just don't take this risk into account, and therefore are the column for comments, of course. We then look at sector level risk. Are we in a sector which is typically known to be involved or exposed to child and forced labor? You also have this list of goods produced by child and forced labor by the US Labor Department. Are we in a sector with a high proportion of female workers? If yes, we would then look at gender risk and how gender is taken into account in the HR policies and working conditions. Is there a high influx of migrant workers? Just to cite a few, are we in a complex supply chain like typically agriculture supply chains with smallholders or mining and so? And then to environment factors as well. Are we in a project which is making extensive use of some natural resources or that is emitting significant pollutants into the air or in the water? And then depending on your answer, you would have to assess those more specifically. And then we look at the project level. And here we perform a Google search analysis using the word of the company, together with keywords like human rights, conflicts, land grabbing. To the extent possible, we try to use the local language. This could be replaced, for example, by the RepRisk tool that Charlotte presented, but at BO we have not decided yet to invest in this tool. And then we also look at other stakeholders' websites and as well into web-based information, but that is area related. So for example, you can have a map of all the indigenous people known around the globe. You can look at where your project is and is there an overlap, for example, as well for biodiversity and flood risk. And so after doing this contextual analysis, we would then summarize the result of it into this tab, and it will also go into the screening note, which goes to the screening committee, as well as to the investment committee note, where we'll have to say to what extent we have responded in our analysis to those risks and to what extent we think they are sufficiently covered. Then I'm going to present the next tool. Let me know if you are seeing it's a Word tool. Is that working here?
No, we're still seeing the Excel. Okay, so I need to stop sharing again. Am I still okay in terms of time? Running a bit behind schedule, but it's all right. Okay. It can take 2-3 minutes. Okay, right, thanks. And then the screening questionnaire, which we would request the client or the potential client to fill just before going to screening committee, with specific questions in terms of, do they have their environmental impact assessment performed? Do they have the environmental permits also for effluent discharge and so forth? Do they have ENS policy in place, people in place to manage environmental and social risks? Questions on labor conditions like minimum age of work, minimum salary, working hours, are there workers' representatives, unions, and so forth?
Pollution as well, question on what are the main waste streams and how they manage these. Have they had any environmental incidents in the past, like oil spills or so? Community safety risk as well, land, biodiversity, indigenous people, etc., etc. We would also as well request whether they have some media or NGO attention, and then we have a list of very short list of documents we would like to receive ideally before screening, so we can go a bit deeper into our analysis at the screening stage. So this is for the tools, and then I just wanted to quickly present, let's say, a few tips on the next phase, which is, yeah, there was also suggestion to go into detail, to look into the Google Earth. This is Google Earth Pro map, which is really useful because you can look at two satellite pictures, but throughout history. So usually you would have pictures from 20 years ago up to now. And this helps you to identify, of course, any change into land use or habitat modification or land acquisition from the project in the past. And in terms of time zero, it helps you as well to identify biodiversity hotspots. So for example, these are fields in Guatemala which are located within a key biodiversity area, but most of these are into the valleys, which are very heavily, or let's say intensively, cultivated. So you could not expect an impact on biodiversity, you know, in the past or in the short term. But you can look in terms of, is there any local river, any local communities that may be affected, and so forth. And looking more into details, these are in red, you have the smallholders. If you zoom to them, then you can easily see that a few of them, for example, this one, have led to very recent deforestation into the mountain slopes, and therefore is clearly triggering an impact on biodiversity in a key biodiversity area. So to be then investigated and managed through a good supply chain sustainability program and traceability program. In terms of due diligence in a nutshell, so then we would go into due diligence. We would first start with sending a detailed documentation request list, make a detailed desktop review, work on some Q&A documents with the clients. And then you have to prepare your agenda for a site visit. So be prepared and make a very clear list of whom you would like to interview, being company workers, HR managers, ENS managers, workers representative, but as well communities or NGOs locally. So plan your visit. Then you go on site, you interview all these people, you make your closure meeting with the client, and then you make your reporting and ENS action plan. A few tips is be prepared. The more you are prepared, the more thoroughly and qualitative will be your due diligence. Seek external expertise as needed. You may not have expertise in every areas. Also, local consultant can bring the local knowledge, which is very helpful. Own your DD. What does it mean is don't let the client, you know, circulate you on site, but you have to tell what you want to see, when and how, and look for the blind spots, so the closed doors and things like that. Triangulate information. So information from the client only is not sufficient. You have to cross-check this with different parties. Working the message to the client is very important. You want him to not to feel ashamed or to hide things. So he needs to feel comfortable and understand the exercise, and that the objective is of course to improve over time and be solution oriented. If you come with too strong recommendations, the client will be lost in translation, and you will not reach your objectives. Be as well aware of limitations of a site due diligence. It's a risk-based approach, so you have to investigate highest risk first, so prioritize things. There are things that you will not be able to cover in such a limited time. There is the client bias, so the client may hide things to you. Be aware of that. And as well be aware that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So if you don't see child on site, it doesn't mean there is no child on site or in the supply chain, but yeah, you can only do what you can do. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Edward. That was super clear and very concrete. Hive, floor is yours.
Yes, very shortly, one minute. So no, I think BOS has developed quite a comprehensive system, and I think at the European level, the FIs have really, started improving their work in this area. What I think are strong points is the fact that it's, let's say, the instruments, the remote control instruments are integrated in a wider approach that can include on-site visits. It wasn't presented here, but there's also quite a well-developed grievance and complaints mechanism also on the website of BO, which I think is good, and also BO has over time developed quite some capacity in this area. A challenge that I do see is again this question on how deep do you go into the value chain and the supply chain with your analysis. Does it stick to the level of the investee, or do you really look more deeply into subcontracting arrangements, working with migrant workers, and these kind of things? So, that would be my main comment for now.
Great, thanks a lot, Hive, for this constructive feedback. Well, now, please, for the last speakers of today, Famke and Matthew from Hive. Famke, I see you've already shared the screen, so up to you.
Yes, thank you, Brieuc, and I'm really pleased to be here today with Hive. I think it will be very interesting because we will also be able to refer a bit to the two previous presentations from our colleagues. But perhaps I'll introduce first Hive. So we're a Brussels-based organization, and we have our expertise focusing on responsible sourcing and trade. We really cover the entire supply chain, and we typically take pride in not only guiding global brand perspectives and the business downstream situation, but we have in our vision, as part of our vision, to actually connect up to the local community realities and to work in high-risk areas. So we started Hive 1.5 years ago, and we are 5 experts. We each bring more than 10-15 years of experience, and I personally came from Deloitte here in Belgium, and we met each other around the conflict minerals regulation, and we realized we had a value to add, to connect the dots in very complex supply chains. And you see on the bottom some of our services that are also relevant for today. So indeed, what is the challenge nowadays? We have quite some businesses that actually are on the verge of kickstarting or really they want to move beyond the sustainability reporting that they have been doing for over years, and they actually want to work more measurable and more targeted towards progress in risk management across the supply chain. But the challenge is that a lot of companies, they are quite hesitant as well, that we find that on the one hand, they have a large lack of visibility on the supply chain. They don't, in many cases, and it's not only small companies, but even the largest multinational firms, they have a lack of visibility, and they do not, they're not sure about origin and provenance of their raw materials. And some companies are also fearful of a sort of box of Pandora. What if we start due diligence and we actually dig into the issues and risk in our supply chain? Will that influence negatively our brand reputation? And can we actually set up the resources to continuously and in a long-term manner deal with these issues? So I think the question is now no longer, will we start this venture, but how do we do that? And this is where we can typically come in. And so on the right side, you see also this really, the importance to get a full perspective on the supply chain, and really move beyond your first tier suppliers and gain these insights on who are the actors, how do they conduct due diligence on their suppliers, but then not only to set up policy and process, but to actually follow up on issues and risk through different types of tools and approaches. But I know that we have already had different sessions prior to this session, and of course the importance of policy and process strategy have already been highlighted. But I think when it comes to risk identification, it cannot be seen apart from indeed these internal channels and clear roles and responsibilities, a very cross-functional approach where you really collaborate with different teams, not only procurement, but also supply chain, legal, and of course, sustainability team. So it's all quite connected. And we really work on the basis of the responsible business conduct guidelines from the OECD. And then there are obviously sector-specific guidelines, for example, for textiles and minerals. And there's currently really an overlapping field of industry standards. And then there's legislation. So what we do with Hive, we typically bring the different frameworks together and support the company to customize their own perspective on due diligence and risk management throughout the supply chain. And it's really important to also mention there that we really want to go beyond legal compliance. I recently saw a Big Four company presentation, and it was all about legal compliance in responsible sourcing. And I didn't really understand how it's possible to only go for legal compliance, because as a company, if you're serious about addressing issues and risk through responsible sourcing, the legal frameworks are typically quite minimum standard. So we take our clients beyond compliance, but that's a step-by-step process. So what I want to do is briefly show some success factors for responsible sourcing and especially dealing with risk in your supply chain. And my colleague Matthew, he's also on the line. I'm sorry I have not yet introduced Matthew, but he will introduce once he takes over. He will take you through a case study on our work in Congo on modern slavery. So one of the first, an important success factor is traceability. And that may not seem a part of your risk management process, but actually it is, because by laying bare or by really digging into a supply chain and finding out all the suppliers up to the origin of your raw materials, whether it's minerals or cotton or palm oil, I think it's a great way to start your risk identification. And it's really the first step of due diligence, but it's also an ongoing process, because you have typically new suppliers onboarding, and at the same time, your existing suppliers may change their supplier relations as well along the road. So it can be the start of a due diligence process, but it's also an ongoing effort to be made. And you see on the bottom, the complexity of a large number of suppliers. Some of our clients have even up to 200, 500 or 1,000 different suppliers. And obviously there are existing tools that supplier management that can be quite useful. But at the same time, doing a traceability effort, it comes down to a supply chain mapping exercise, which may be quite a very hands-on exercise. So for example, we guide our clients also in supply chain mapping through questionnaires that we escalate from first tier supplier to second up to the source. So this is important to ascertain full traceability, I think, as part of your due diligence. And you can start with maybe one commodity as a pilot project, for example. And here is a very practical example why supply chain mapping is already part of your risk identification. So, for example, we have a company, hypothetically based in Brussels, and they have a supplier, and the supplier has another supplier, and traders are taking an important role in between, and they are able to ascertain provenance to up to various farmer sites in one country, and there are other farmer sites in another country. But at country level, there are 26 different smallholder farming sites. So that is origin, but it's a country level origin. But then it's really important to to go further up to the community level. And it's also complex that the different smallholder farming sites, they're very the ownership is difficult to be determined, and so that in itself already shows that there's a risk, namely beneficial ownership risk, which relates to possibly anti-money laundering. This is maybe in smallholder farming is not very relevant, but for example in like palm oil or minerals, definitely beneficial ownership is something to take into account when you do your supply chain mapping. Typically nowadays, upstream assurance mechanisms, they exist as well. So those are standards, industry standards that actually really work at local country level. And they can be very useful when you have, when you know that your final suppliers, they are part of one of those mechanisms. Well, another success factor is really to prioritize and integrate your ESG issues at an early stage. And so my colleagues, our colleagues from BioInvest and Credenda already showed indeed the wide type of different risks that are in scope, and it's of course important to emphasize again that they're really unique to sectors and products and even to locations. One of the useful ways to identify which risks are material to your organization is, for example, to conduct a materiality assessment. That is essentially to ask your stakeholders, it can be people from the board, but also customers and even suppliers, which of the environmental and social and governance issues are important or relevant in this specific supply chain. And such a materiality assessment can provide you with a very good an overview of the different risks, and it allows you to then prioritize some of those issues that you can then translate into your policy and also into your risk and due diligence approach. Of course, the different industry standards, they are also very useful to get a better perspective on risks. So on cotton, we have Better Cotton Initiative. On palm oil, the Roundtable Sustainable Palm Oil. In minerals, there are really a lot of like spaghetti bowl of standards as well. But at the same time, it's also a guideline, and in the end, as a company, you have to really make your own decision in that sense. And to prioritize risks, it's also useful and to use a different type of tools that were already showed, and they can also reflect different types of issues for the different materials in your supply chain. So supplier engagement, I think that is really really a basic and very, very important part of due diligence. But supplier engagement already starts with your procurement process to really prevent that high-risk suppliers join your company as a business relation. And it can also be very interesting as a company to put in place a set of preconditions for suppliers to join your organization, and obviously these already exist as part of your existing procurement process. For example, know your customer, KYC conditions, and it will be very interesting to develop a set of responsible sourcing targets, KPIs, on responsible sourcing in your procurement process. So for example, Nestle has the target to have 100% sustainably sourcing of palm oil, for example, and then they require their new suppliers to adhere to the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil. Obviously, in some sectors, and I think this is quite interesting now in Brussels, for example, there's a lot of discussion about strategic autonomy, and there's pressure on access to raw materials. So as a company, you have different goals to weigh, and you may also want to accept suppliers that are perhaps not top of the top in their own due diligence and responsible sourcing practices, but are still acceptable and are perhaps able to improve with your guidance. And now, for example, with the minerals for the green transition, this is really it's really quite relevant, because there's a lot of competition for access to raw materials, and I think this puts a lot of stress also on our ambition towards responsible sourcing. It's perhaps interesting for the discussion. So there are different types of tools that can be used, indeed, self-declaration, but also questionnaires prior to the procurement process. One thing I want to mention here, that of course, as a company, if you have a lot of change in your suppliers, that complicates your due diligence process, because it stands in the way of developing a long-term relationship with your suppliers and to have good understanding on what are their due diligence issues. So then there is the continuous relationship with existing, ensuring that you get a continuous information flow on how your suppliers are doing in their own due diligence. So how do they deal with their suppliers? Do they identify risk and issues? And if there are any incidents, for example, will they be able to report that up to your business as part of their supplier code of conduct, for example? So we typically talk about choke points in the supply chain, and these are, for example, in the minerals supply chain, this is here taken as example, smelters and refiners are really very important, and they have a lot of information about the different type of suppliers that actually come together in their on their role in the supply chain. So these choke points, they're also very often the actors that receive incidents, and they're very valuable to your due diligence process, because this relationship with this smelter, for example, will allow you to research the specific incidents, whether they are reflect a structural issue, or they're a one-off issue that doesn't need further inquiry.
Sorry, Famke, we have to wrap up, especially if Matthew still has to speak.
Yeah. I want to highlight even also the red flag assessment that is important here, that's because there's basic due diligence, and you only do very strong due diligence, enhanced due diligence through site visits and audits if there are certain red flags that are met. So they were already mentioned by my colleague. Two final success factors. One is to really ensure communication channels, because it's not only about proactive risk identification, but also about reactive, opening your communication for possible complaints or incidents. A grievance procedure is extremely important nowadays, but also through, for example, social media, and even at the local level. Sometimes farmers or mining communities, they want to have just a simple text message, telephone number, and so these simple ways of opening up your relations to local stakeholders are also not to be forgotten. Right, so typically companies develop a risk management approach, and also then translate this management system for risk into internal processes. And we have beautiful examples on how this is to be done, but this will be for another time, I suppose. Here you also see our maturity model that is, I think, relevant to show that every company has its own maturity, and it's really about growing step by step and commensurate with your level of management and also with your ambitions. Right, so Matthew, my colleague, will now take over and provide you with an example on modern slavery.
Really, in a few minutes, please, so we have time for the Q&A at the end.
Yep, challenge
Thanks,
accepted.
Matthew.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks, Femke. My name is Matthew Wojcik, and I work as a project analyst and a responsible sourcing expert for Hive. So I'm just going to walk you through, I'm going to share with you a glimpse of how to uphold due diligence at the upstream level, so supply chains. So at Hive, we work with upstream participants to help them understand their role in the supply chain. And we work in complex places. And because we can't always trust and rely on supply chain actors themselves for the information in those places, well, what we do is we leverage local expertise and knowledge, aka, for instance, civil society organizations who are able to give an external outlook on what is going on in the supply chain and to triangulate information. So we do that, we tap into local knowledge, but we do that in a very specific way. We use the DataStake risk management platform. So that's an online tool to collect, consolidate, monitor, and also share data on supply chains. So it's a formidable opportunity, as I said, to tap into the knowledge of local supply chain participants and also local stakeholders. And it's not just for Hive to use, it's for everyone we work with in the context of our projects. And so people report information on negative and positive events at the upstream level. They help map out the supply chain locations. They provide information on the supply chain participants, on the trade relationships, and what is of interest today, also on risks. So through that platform, we are able to establish a continuous and structured information flux at the upstream level, which in turn can help inform risk management strategies at downstream level. Yeah, next slide, please. That's okay. So that's the theory. Now moving on to the practice, we recently completed a project with the UK Foreign Office. In 2015, the UK passed the Modern Slavery Act, and that just means the UK companies are required to explain and publish how they identify and analyze risks along the supply chain, which are related to modern slavery. Modern slavery is a broad term, but it encompasses 4 different realities: forced labor, child labor, sexual exploitation and harassment, and also human trafficking. So we thought, okay, how do we do that? And our location was Congo, the eastern provinces of Congo, and we worked on artisanal and small-scale mining sites. Those are the opposite of industrial large-scale mining sites. It's where there's very little regulation, monitoring, and the state is not yet there to regulate everything. So an important point is that you can receive funding from government entities. They are there to back you up if you have ideas or you have challenges you want to address within your supply chains. That's something you should remember this. I will skip the details of the project and I will move right on to the risk management framework. So what we're able to do with this framework within DataStake is 4 things. First of all, is this risk relevant to the location of my supply, to my supply chain locations? Yes, no, if so, please provide some details. And we have some follow-up questions. Second of all, okay, I have a clearer picture of what the risks are, but now how to assess them. So we do so by providing information on 3 points: the threat, the level of threat of the risk, the vulnerability of the people on the ground. So that means, are they in a position to do something about the risk, or are they completely left to themselves? And finally, what is the impact of that risk? Is it really heavy impact, or is it a low impact? Once you have that information, you are able, still within the system, you are able to plan and to suggest measures to mitigate the risk. This can come from the local level, so the local people on the ground who say, okay, based on the assessment, we think that these are the key next steps that need to be done. Or it can be from the client perspective who gets that information. And finally, you manage the risk. That means you carry out the activities which you hope are going to tackle risk. And once they're done, and let's say they had a positive impact, you carry out a new assessment because it's a new reality, new planification, new management, etc., etc. So that's how it works in a nutshell. Here you have a glimpse, you have a few pictures of local partners we worked with in the context of their projects. So what they did is they went to those mining areas and communities. They had a good idea of what questions to ask. They checked if anything was being done to prevent child labor. They then come back to their HQ. They enter the information they collected onto their laptops, into DataStake. And at the Hive level, we're able to verify the information through our experts. And this is but a glimpse, and I'm afraid I won't be able to give you a small tour of the platform, but here you have a screenshot of what the data that enter looks like in terms of outputs for the client. So let's say, so that's what the UK Foreign Office, for instance, were able to see in the context of the modern slavery project. That's what all the data that was entered by the local partners was filtered through the system and presented into outputs. And you can follow, you can track progress, you can monitor, you can suggest other ways to move on, etc. So in a nutshell, we developed a tool, DataStake, which is a great tool to carry out due diligence because it has two essential attributes to carry out effective due diligence, and that is scalability across other countries. I gave you Congo as an example. We also work in Colombia and in Burkina Faso, and also across sectors. So this example was mineral sector, but we also work in the agricultural sector and textile sector. And finally, sustainability. The UK started a project, they gathered data, they have the possibility to do another project through the platform and to recycle that data. So that means that data is not lost and they can always consult it and think of what to do next. That's it for me. I will leave it there and I'll leave the floor now back to Shift.
Thanks, Matthew, for brushing up. That was super clear again. I will leave the floor to Hive for a quick feedback. We have 10 minutes for the feedback, Q&A, and conclusion. We might pass a bit 12:30 planning, but I think that's all right. Hive.
Okay, great. Just a few points. So first of all, good to hear that Hive is aligning its approach, of course, with the OECD due diligence guidelines that are really the reference framework to work with. Maybe on the issue of traceability and really mapping all the information on the ground, I think that's indeed an important step, and especially, for example, in agricultural value chains, cacao, coffee, and so on. A lot of companies are investing significantly in this, but at the same time, the how is really important in the sense that a lot of observers in the field have argued that it's best to invest in those kind of data solutions. I'm looking forward to hear later how Hive looks at that, but data solutions where the ownership of the data is with the local suppliers or with the local actors, to avoid that only third parties are benefiting from the data that is collected. Also to design these kind of systems that talk to each other. There was one example given on a recent event about cacao where, farmer cooperatives had to enter the same type of information in 4 different systems for different buyers. And there was a lot of duplication, a lot of time lost because of that. And finally, also that, ideally, I think that the data that is collected, that it covers the main areas and doesn't zoom only in one area, for example, child labor, but that it sort of is quite comprehensive to avoid, again, many different rounds of data collection for the same setting. So I think these were my remarks.
Great, thanks a lot, Hive. All right, so let's go through the questions now. I see that there aren't that many questions, so that's fine. If you have more questions, please ask them now, or you can contact the speakers directly afterwards. First question is for Fernando, but maybe others can respond to. Is the EcoVadis tool useful to already get enough information on a company's E&S policy? Charlotte, do you have something to say about this?
Alors, no, the answer will be quite short because, to be honest, we never used this tool yet, by my knowledge, because for information, I'm at Credendo since 1 year now only. But I would be happy to study this tool and see how it can improve our process. But I will check this definitely.
Yeah, I know it's been used by several retailers, and including.
Is it free or?
I don't think so.
No, it's yeah, because everything that is that needs payment, because we are public, it needs a lot of administrative steps, of course. So it takes time, but always open to check for new tools, because indeed, as I said, it's one of the main challenges. Definitely to identify the most relevant and objective tool to improve our process.
Anyone else on EcoVadis?
Maybe you can shortly react. I think, yeah, there is quite a different. There's a whole set of tools that are available out there. I think at the end of the day, what remains a challenge is that these tools will typically be able to say something about, you know, the company, either northern based or in low middle income countries, based on secondary information, as I was saying. What is much more difficult is, of course, saying something about a specific project or a transaction, you know, that takes place in a setting and where certain steps need to be taken. Of course, these tools don't know about this specific project and transaction and can say very little. So it remains important to invest in this sort of almost manual capacity to assess and take those additional steps.
Yeah. Thank you, Hive. So there were two other questions, but I think they are one question. And it's probably a question that was on many people's lips today, is are the BIOS tool available to anyone? And I think it was answered already in the chat that unfortunately not, but as you've seen during the presentation, they can be good inspiration for all of you. I don't know if you want to add something, Edouard.
No, yes. No, actually not, unfortunately, also because, I mean, the tool, you have the contextual risk screening tool. We developed it starting from a DEG tool. So it's a V02 of the tool that was developed by someone else. So it makes it even more complicated to share. And as well, we are working with the Danish Institute for Human Rights on developing a human rights guidance note at the ETFI level. And a tool that will accompany the guidance note, and it's not going to be a public guidance note. It's going to be an internal guidance note, and the tool will take over as well this tool. So for these different reasons, I'm not able to share the tool. I'm sorry, but I take it as a compliment. Thanks.
Indeed. All right. There doesn't seem to be any more questions. If you have one, you have a few seconds to shoot, but otherwise I'll just start with the conclusion. And so we can end this webinar just on time. Let me share the last slide, which doesn't have much content. Yes, here we go. How's my because I took a few notes during the presentation with some just takeaways. So we've seen today that there exist multiple tools and an approach. And it's important to assess what is most relevant for your company or your organization, and we hope this would now help you with that, and particularly the feedbacks from Hive as well. It's important also to assess priorities, to focus on most urgent risk and those that you can have most impact on. Get help from local actors to understand the reality on the ground. That's key, I think, to communicate with them directly. The question is no longer will we start this due diligence adventure, but how? And this is confirmed by the perspective of legislation at the European level and maybe at the Belgian level as well. It's always difficult to know when your responsibilities stop, and it's often used as an excuse for some actors not to do much, unfortunately, but everyone should do their part of work, and it's important to liaise with other actors and stakeholders so that your respective processes are complementary and reinforcing each other. And I think Charlotte, you've stressed that, and others as well. So work with your suppliers, work with your clients, work with your partners. They've done something, and you can always use those information. There's a lot of information available on the internet. Use that with, of course, some limitations. So it's important to use as many sources as possible. Sometimes our practices contribute to creating or reinforcing the risks. That's important to remember. For instance, if we put time or cost pressure on your clients or suppliers, then you might increase the risk that they are facing and that they are putting on the environment or the local communities or the workers. Keep investing and reinforcing in tools, and we've seen there are always more tools coming, and we all need to find what's most adapted to our organization. But it's great to see that the systems are being strengthened all the time. Even though it's never-ending story, as the environment is constantly changing. In particular, when you're changing your suppliers, as you need to recreate a trustful relationship with the new suppliers or new players. Keep showing progress and improvement. That is key. No one is perfect. No one is doing it perfectly. So let's accept it and learn and improve together, and target like an improvement and really progress. ENS and ESG stuff is almost always under-resourced, and I think you'll all agree with me today. But the expertise is generally increasing, and that's great to see. But of course, organizations could always put more resource on those issues. Most important, don't forget that the first to face these risks are the workers and local populations. I think it should always be about them first. And if you focus on your company's risk only and the reputation of your company only, then you may not change much where it's most needed, and you will always be facing risk. So communicate first to those people so they know whom to report to in case they are facing human rights abuse, destruction of their environment, etc. In a connected world, this is the best way to protect your organization's reputation and avoid legal issues. So that's it for today. If you have any good due diligence practice to share, please let me know, because we are keen to keep improving the practical expertise in Belgium, and we need those great sources of inspiration, as we've seen with our speakers today. So all I'm left to do is to say a big thank you to our speakers today. With the summer holidays coming and the end of the academic year, I know the last weeks were quite tense. But still, you all managed to find the time to prepare your very comprehensive, interesting presentation and share your tools with the audience. So that's great. So thank you to all of you, and of course, thank you to all attendees today. And have a great day and enjoy your summer, because it's not holidays for everybody, but summer for everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brieuc, also.
Thanks for everything.